Good morning, British and American culture. As you know, we did our first quiz yesterday, which was, for the most part, a success, but lots of people had trouble with certain things, including me. Obviously, the biggest problem was some students didn't log in on time or had some technical problems or didn't follow the instructions. That meant that you missed the quiz completely because there was only a 10-minute window. Now, I've already sent an email about these issues to everyone, so it's your responsibility to read the email, but let me just re-emphasize that the quiz is only worth 4% of your grade. There's 5 quizzes that count out of the 6. So if you actually, there was about 15 students who didn't finish the quiz in time or didn't do it properly, so the form was not accepted. Those students, you're not going to be affected at all as long as you do the next 5. This one doesn't matter. You're not going to be any far behind somebody who had a 10 if the rest of your quizzes are done well. That being said, the people that did do the quiz, there were several 10s, several people got perfect. Those people get to keep the 10s, and later, if you have a bad quiz or you make a mistake, then you use that. It's like a mulligan in golf. So you can just save your mulligan. If you never need it, then good for you. But I'm a bad golfer, so occasionally I have a bad hole, and you might have a bad quiz, and you can just erase that one. So it's the top 5 out of 6. Also, just because I'm really concerned about cheating, maybe more paranoid than I should be, because I have caught people cheating in recent years in class. It's a lot more difficult to catch students when they're writing in their own homes or in a cafe. First of all, use your own device and write the quiz by yourself. Don't talk to anybody else. Those are the rules. If for some reason anybody finds out that you are cheating, then you will fail the course. There's no reason to give you a second chance. You all know you have to do the quiz yourself. In order to facilitate less tempting situations for cheating, the quiz is only 10 minutes long. So if I make it 30 minutes long, people can wander around and search for things, but you've got to have the information in your memory. Even if, like I said, you have your book in front of you, it's going to take you time to look things up. So the people that know the answers and have already studied will finish easily, and the people who are scrambling to try and get the information from somewhere will not. That's the reason why the quiz is so short. Secondly, the answers are all scrambled. Now, in this situation, I made an error, but I had no idea that that was the case. When I practiced the quiz myself, I submitted the quiz myself, there was no issue. But they actually scramble all the questions and all the answers too. So one of the questions was related to King Arthur, and it was, I believe, A, he was a Romano-Briton, B, he was a legend, C, he was an Englishman, D, A and B, or E, A and C. But unfortunately for most students, it mixed the order, so it didn't make sense. So I got a bunch of emails telling me immediately that that question made no sense. And I at first thought, what are you talking about? I wrote it correctly, but when I looked at the results, I found that only 6 people out of almost 40 people got that question right. And the average for the average correct answers, the best question was something like 27 or 28, 30, low 30s, and only 6 people got that question right. So clearly that question had an error. So that question's essentially just those 6 people who got it right are going to keep their point, and everybody in the class who wrote the exam will get the point too. So it won't matter, right? So if you got that question wrong because you were confused, I apologize. That probably took a few minutes for you to try and figure out, and you're like, what's going on? And there was no professor in the room to put your hand up. That's all. There's nothing I can do about that, but tell you that I didn't know that's the way things would be, the way the form would randomize things. So that won't happen again. That's one of the worst things about the quiz. Doing it online and doing it quickly is the fact that if you want to ask a question about what something means, or you need, me to clarify something, I can't do it. So because of that, I've decided to reduce the overall value of the quizzes. So instead of the quizzes being worth 20%, they're only going to be worth 15. So each quiz of your top 5 will only be worth 3%, okay? But like I said, nobody has lost anything. Nobody's behind. You don't need to be concerned. Okay, so everybody, I know some people are panicking, but you didn't actually lose anything. You just have to make sure the next quiz you do it properly. Some people logged on Zoom. All you have to do is go to the CNU portal, and where you log in for your cyber lectures, there's going to be a quiz on that week, right underneath, right? You just click on that quiz and it says quiz week 3. It was quiz W3, okay? And that means the quiz for the content from week 3. Okay, it was supposed to be last week. So the next quiz is going to be on the board. Just go there and click it. And the reason that you have to do that is because I can set the limit. The form closes at 10:10, but I can't set when it opens. Okay, I'll write down this information clearly to you on the website to help you. But the thing is, we need to keep marching forward, or we're going to run out of time for teaching you the content of the course. I don't want to spend all my time about technical stuff. So just be aware, some of you are still trying to get a hold of your textbooks. I know. I'm keeping all the quizzes based on the lectures. So pay attention to me and pay attention to the website. After Chuseok, though, I'm going to start referring to things to the book and asking you to read parts of the book. I haven't done that yet because it's not fair. Honestly, there's one student who's in China right now and she can't get a hold of the book. So later today, she's going to wire me money and I'm going to personally go to the post office and send her a book. Okay, so just so you know, all of you students, I'm doing my best to make things fair here. Don't think that if something goes wrong, you're going to be punished. Just follow the instructions and do your best and you will do fine in this class. Okay, so those of you who emailed me yesterday in a panic, you missed the first quiz or you made a mistake or whatever, we'll figure it out, but we need to move on. So question, whichever question it was, I believe it was question 9. King Arthur question is a free question for everyone. Now, we need, as I said, to keep going. Next week we have a holiday because it's Chuseok. We need to do another quiz before. I'm looking at the schedule for this semester and we really need to keep going in order to get all the material in before we have Chuseok. So we need to do a quiz next Tuesday. It's going to be the same concept, okay? So, sorry, not next Tuesday. Pardon me. I'm not going to erase that, so listen carefully again. We have class on Monday. Monday is our other class. We have a 2-hour class on Thursday and we have a 1-hour class on Monday. So what's going to happen on Monday is there's going to be quiz number 2. All right? So what I talked about the Normans last class and what I'm talking about this class, this is going to be a longer lecture for sure. I'm anticipating anyway. All of the things I said in last class about King William and the Normans, plus everything I say on this class is the content for the quiz on Monday. And I apologize for squishing them together, but this is the only way that we're going to get through the material by, we need to do the other things. After the quizzes, we have another assignment to do and we have to prepare for the midterm exam. So this will be your second chance. I will put up some instructions. The secretary Yongnam already sent instructions in Korean, but I will send instructions again. And if you figured out your mistake, no problem. A few students messaged me their screenshots and stuff and they realized their mistake right away. So it's on the cyber lecture list. When you go to your cyber lecture, you will see the quiz, and when the quiz opens at 9:59, you need to open that link, fill out the form, close it, and make sure you press the right button. Some people, you have to submit the form, okay? Make sure it's in Korean if it's on your phone, so there should be no excuses there. Don't click on the wrong button. Okay, so today we're going to get through as much of what we call the high Middle Ages as we can. the Viking Age ended essentially with William the Conqueror taking over England. So from that point, as I said, the French language obviously has a huge influence because it's the official language of business and high culture. Latin is the language of the church and to a certain extent law, and English is just the common language of the people. So surprisingly, during this period from about 1066 to for the next 200 years, you're going to have a lot of multilingual people. It's the kind of way I think of Switzerland right now. Like Switzerland, people in Switzerland, if you are bilingual, that's disappointing, you know? People are trilingual or they're polyglots. People speak 4 languages all the time there. I have I have a friend of mine who lives in Switzerland. She's married to a Swiss guy and he speaks 3 languages perfectly. Usually it's German, Italian, French, and Romansh. But whatever. In this situation, going back 1,000 years, we always think of British culture and American culture as being, you know, monolinguistic. That's not true because there's a lot of Americans who speak Spanish and Canadians speak French. And certainly there are British people who speak other languages. But generally, the British got the reputation of being monolinguistic, of just doing everything in English. This is not the case 1,000 years ago. There's a different language for different purposes, and if you're an educated person, 3 languages at least. Some of these kings and queens will know 4 or 5 languages because they will know Spanish and Italian or something else, or German in addition to the 3 main ones, Latin, French, and English. So remember, many of these people, French is their first language. If they're noble born, if they're separated from the poor people by castles and wealth and soldiers and curtains and lifestyle, then they're probably using French primarily, and English is just something to yell announcements and orders to the common people. So we're going to start out with this, the Great Chain of Being. The Great Chain of Being is something that really goes all the way back to Greek culture. And in Greek culture, Aristotle came up with this sort of order of all living things. He was basically trying to classify everything. Aristotle was a philosopher. Philosoph means, philo means love, and Sophia means knowledge. So he was really what you would call, I guess, a polyglot. He was studying all kinds of different disciplines. He was really into, you know, biology, I guess you could say, studying the environment, in particular classifying animals into groups. And that's one of the reasons why the real species names of, you know, all animals and plants, they have a scientific name, and that scientific name is Greek. So Aristotle came up with this idea of order of things from the smallest, least important, least capable forms of living things, all the way up to human beings at the top. And it wasn't very hard for the people in church to decide that, well, that would work well with us too, except we'll include also God and heaven and angels above that. And then below them, just below them, are humans, and humans can go either way. Humans can either, you know, get closer to the animals and be lower, or they can become higher and be more like God, or more like imitations of or followers of God, as in the saints and the Pope and the bishops, supposedly, anyway. So this hierarchy goes down from the heavens all the way down to the earth. And this is the way the whole society is organized, not just between animals and plants and humans and angels, but within the human species itself. You've got the Pope at the top and the kings right there, kind of mixed in at that level. They've been chosen by God to lead people, and that's where they belong. And then there's people below the king and the Pope to help them. And below them, there's just levels of people all the way down to slaves. And this is a very important idea because you still see the effects of this organization of human levels. When people look down at people of different classes and think they belong there, like in Indian culture where they have divided people into different classes permanently, right? You're in a caste. Or when people are being racist and trying to make arguments that one type of person who has looks one way is higher or superior. We call it white superiority in the case of a white person being racist against others. It's kind of, this idea isn't racist itself or a caste system, but you can see how the principle of ordering things in a certain way according to your perspective would be restrictive for most people. Most people aren't close to heaven. Most people are close to the earth, and they're slaves or peasants or serfs, and that's where they belong. So the system that William brought, it was already sort of there, but in a stricter, broader sense. Basically, when he came and took over the country, like I said, he took control of it personally. So England became his own personal territory, his property. And he basically ruled over everyone, and all of the people that were defeated, the Anglo-Saxons and the Britons and anybody else who was living there, all the people that were the subjects of Harold, they automatically went to the bottom level. Right? So and they lost all of their property. So in order to keep their property, they had to make a contract with a Norman lord, usually, and this is called serfdom, and we call it feudalism, right? So they created this system where people who were wealthy had castles and big houses, and they owned all the land, and the rest of the people worked on the land and paid their taxes to keep the land. And in return, the local lord, of course, should protect them, keep them safe. If there was any army that was attacking or there was thieves, they were supposed to keep order and law and protect them. But of course, they took advantage of them all the time, just like any government system. We'll talk about this much later when we get to American culture, as the tension between having more government control and less. So this is the problem. They have really, the upper class has a kind of iron grip on the people, based somewhat on their culture, somewhat on their language, somewhat on their social system, and they use religious ideas and philosophical ideas to reinforce this. So people actually believed they had a place that they were born into. Like I said, in a way, not so different than being born into a caste. You're not supposed to rise up to become a king if you're born a peasant. There is more mobility in England, we will see next class, but basically this is what the ideal order was, and this is what the kingdom should look like. Of course, it didn't always happen. Right, so what was the community life like? Well, I don't want to talk about Christianity for a moment. I always assume that most people know the basic ideas of Christianity, but let me go over it really briefly. So, the Roman Empire was transformed into a Christian empire by the efforts of a sequence of Christian emperors. So it was a gradual change, but in the beginning, Christianity was a sort of cult, you might say. They were a small group of rebels, and they refused to worship the Roman gods. So they were persecuted. Many of them were killed. All the stories about feeding Christians to the lions, and Nero trying to track them down, throw them in jail, and kill them. So the emperors didn't like these Christians because they refused to worship the Roman gods, and they refused to recognize the emperor as a divine figure. However, Constantine and other emperors came along, and they decided that they would use Christianity for their own purposes to motivate and unify their purpose to take over the empire, which they did. And gradually the whole Roman Empire transformed into a Christian state, a Christian superstate. And even though the Roman Empire collapsed and divided into different pieces, the religious leadership remained and provided the framework for a continued religious empire, almost in the same shape. The Christian states left over had the same shape as the empire, just they were not unified by government or by a single administration. But they were all unified by their religion. So England is no different. They just briefly, while the Anglo-Saxons and the Vikings were around, they kind of lost their way, and the small Christian community there was wiped out. And then after the Anglo-Saxons were converted later, like Alfred, they become Christian again. So there's 200 or 300 years where Britain is not Christian, and then they become re-Christianized. It's not really that important, but Alfred is certainly Christian, and Arthur originally, the real Arthur was not. King Arthur was Christian because of the story, but if there was a real guy in 500 AD, he was a pagan, not a Christian. Beowulf, the story about Beowulf, one of the oldest English poems we still have. Originally, Beowulf had nothing to do with Christianity either. Just later, Christian writers added Christianity to the theme. So, the most important thing in the society is religion. You have to follow the king, but the king is also chosen by God. So the king rules by divine right. And you have a responsibility to follow that king no matter what, as long as he's following God's will. And since the king would argue, since I was chosen by God, I can do whatever I want. That argument starts to fall apart very quickly, but that's essentially, I've been chosen by God, and you are God's people, so you should follow me. Likewise, the Pope has this power too. And to a certain extent, the Pope has more power than any king. And sometimes the king and the Pope disagree, and it's difficult to decide who should be correct, or who has the most political power or influence on the people. So these struggles continue, and eventually it'll result in some serious conflict between English kings and queens and the Pope, which will result in England leaving. But for our purpose right now, we have to understand this is Catholic England. Everybody's Catholic. Everybody's religious. If you went back in time, if you think you're religious now and you go to church once a week, or you pray every night, or even you go to Bible study, some of you might, some of you don't, but these people lived every day religiously. Everything they did, they prayed. They couldn't read the Bible because it was in Latin, but they participated in every ceremony. Every holiday was organized by the church. If they had a family problem, they went to the church. If they were poor, they went to the church for help. If your parents died and nobody in your family could take care of you, the church would take care of you instead. You would become orphans, and the church would raise you. They would organize community events. Sometimes they would discipline people if you had broken the law. Sometimes a priest would be the judge of all kinds of things. And basically there was no town hall in a town. There was no Jumin Center or Yusanguchang or whatever. There was a church, and that was the center of the community. And the leader of that, if it was a small town, it was a priest. And if it was a cathedral town, it was a big one, it would be a bishop. So everything, they looked at everything from a religious perspective. They looked at everything as a Christian person who was dedicated to God, and things happened because God wanted them to happen, or because of something they did. So that's what community life was like. It was it revolved around Christianity very closely. So, a very shocking event to me happened. Europe had been, since the Roman Empire, Europe had at least been fragmented and lost some of the technology, organization, trade, economic development, all kinds of things sort of were lost and needed to be recovered later when the Roman Empire fell. Lots of places became disconnected. The thing that kept them connected a lot was the fact that they used to travel for religious reasons, what we call a pilgrimage. Just the way that millions of people in Islam go to Mecca every year. That's called a pilgrimage in English. And it means that they want to dedicate themselves, their life, to God. And they undertake this for certain reasons. Sometimes it's to purify yourself. Sometimes it's to punish yourself. Sometimes it's to ask for forgiveness. Sometimes somebody in your family is sick, so you want to pray to a certain saint. They did this stuff all the time. So there's constantly these movements of people. People went from England to Spain and France, and some of them were not rich. They would do something called a barefoot pilgrimage, and they would just walk with no shoes, just to make it harder. Or maybe they wouldn't have any shoes if they were poor, but people would do this. And the ultimate place to go was Jerusalem, the place the location of Jesus' death, right? The Holy Land, Bethlehem, where he was born, and Jerusalem, where the shrine was for you to visit and pray directly to Jesus. So, if you know your history, that whole area was taken over by Islam. There were different empires, caliphates that ruled that area. So the Byzantines, the former Roman Empire, or Christian people had no control over it. And they wanted to retake, that was the original reason for this mission or expedition, was to retake the Holy Land. So at the end of the very end of the 11th century, don't worry about, around 1100, just before 1100, a pope started preaching a crusade in France. And the idea just spread through the religious communities like wildfire, because he said, if you go on the crusade, not only will you recover the Holy Land for Christianity, for us, but you will also, I will forgive everything. You'll be forgiven every bad thing you ever did. Your sins will be absolved. This was a very attractive thing to a person who believed they had to pray all the time, every time they made a mistake. And also there was, for some people, upper class people, they had 5 sons in their family, and the first son would get the castle, and the second son would be a bishop, and the third son would have nothing to do. So there was all these kind of nobles that wanted to be heroes. And so they gathered together thousands and thousands of Europeans, and somehow, without sinking all their boats or getting too sick or starving or getting lost, they made all the way to where Israel is now. They went through Turkey and down through Syria, and they took over a pretty big sized chunk of the Middle East, which they called Outremer. Now, I don't want to get too much farther into that. It's in the textbook, like I said, but the Crusades, this is the main reason that the Crusades happened. It was for glory, it was for God, it was for forgiveness of sins, and it was for money, right? A lot of the motivation for fighting in this period, 1,000 years ago, is if you win, you get to burn down the city and take all the people as slaves and steal all their stuff, their gold, their pottery, their metal, their weapons, their curtains, their tapestries, their artwork. That's what they used to do. They used to sack. In English, it's called sacking a city. After you take over a city, you destroy it and you take all the stuff. It's a terrible, terrible thing. Lots of people would get killed, and it was violent and crazy. But this was the motivation for some of these people, and so that's why the Crusaders are not exactly as heroic as they may sound. Like, we're fighting for Christianity and we're going to take the Holy Land back, but their behavior was really not. Their behavior was brutal and unnecessary. They killed people randomly. They terrorized. They were basically terrorizing the people that lived there, and those people had been living there for, in some cases, hundreds of years, maybe longer. So they went there. One of the main figures, one of the leaders in the Third Crusade, which is about 100 years later, is King Richard. And King Richard is famous because he is told as the king that's on crusade during the story of Robin Hood. But I'm not going to talk about Robin Hood now. We'll just talk about the Lionheart. He was the ideal warrior king. I talked about Arthur earlier. He actually had a sword which he claimed was Excalibur. So this king was tall. He was a great fighter. He killed many people himself. He charged around on a horse, just like you'd imagine, like a romantic knight, saving princesses and singing songs in between battles and acting gallantly. He spoke multiple languages. He traveled around France and England. He went down to the Holy Land and he led the Christian army against a great Muslim leader named Saladin the Great. So they had this great encounter down there, and in the end, it was kind of a stalemate, but Richard won some victories and he came back and he just made England prestigious. England at this point had Normandy and Aquitaine because of Richard's mother, and parts of northern France and western France were part of England. So he sort of had a bit of an empire. Parts of England are connected to Europe, And King Richard, sometimes he's romanticized as the greatest medieval king. Certainly, he behaved the way people wanted to imagined him. Right? He was a warrior king. He was intelligent, especially he was good at organization and logistics. He got his army all the way to the Holy Land, won some battles, came all the way back. Essentially, people looked up to him and admired him. And then he died. Okay, now I'm going to talk about, briefly, I'm going to go back. As I said, it's not really in order of time anymore. We're talking about in order of topic. So, like I said, Christianity is one of the main things that you need to get your head around, is that everybody's super religious. It's just not the same. Lots of Korean people go to church, but if you imagine your most religious friend, somebody who is always doing church stuff and always talking about God no matter what, you can't change the subject. Everybody was like that. That was normal, okay? Everybody was talking about that all the time. Henry II was Richard's father. He married Eleanor of Aquitaine, and that made northern France join up with England to expand the kingdom. He was a great leader and a great king, but he was very temperamental. He couldn't control his temper. There's stories about him getting angry about something and then screaming and then pounding his hands on the ground like a child and then chewing the carpet because he was so worked up with anger. So this is Henry II. This is Richard's father. He's a good leader. He organizes laws. He reorganizes the kingdom. He adds some territory to France. So generally, he's a pretty well-liked leader. But he does have this tendency to be very violent and decisive in a sort of scary way. So he grows up with a person named Thomas Becket. And Thomas Becket's not an important person, but he's really good friends with Henry. And so when Henry needs a new bishop, the Archbishop of Canterbury, he chooses him to be that archbishop, even though he doesn't really have a lot of training in the church. You have to remember, this is going to be important later too, that church training was not really you didn't have to demonstrate that you were a pure person to become a leader in the church. Basically, you just had to have political connections. And then either the Pope would appoint you or a king would put you in your position. And that would generate a lot of money and power for you. So Thomas Becket and Henry were really good friends. And so Henry thought he would just listen to everything he said. But when Thomas Becket became archbishop, he decided to take it seriously. So he protected the rights of the church, and he wouldn't do anything that he thought was bad, according to the Bible or the way that a priest should behave. So Henry, every time Henry tried to do something a little bit corrupt, as politicians do, tried to have more control or take something from the church, Thomas Becket blocked him because his first priority was taking care of the church, not helping his best friend. So Henry put up with this for a while, but then he freaked out and exiled him to France. And he had to stay there for 5, 6, 7 years. And then eventually he came back. And they tried to make an agreement, a compromise to get along, but there was some sort of misunderstanding. So again, when Henry tried to do something, make a law, tax something, or control some appointments in the church, Thomas Becket blocked him. So the story goes that Henry II was so, again, angry, probably chewing carpets, screaming, stamping around. He said, "Will no one rid me of this turbulent priest?" And I think most of his knights and his soldiers and his officials were used to listening to him and being like, "Oh, he's really angry, we better make this happen." So 4 of his knights heard him say that, supposedly. They left and went to England. I think he was in northern France. They went to England and they went to the cathedral, Canterbury Cathedral, and found Becket and told him, "You got to come with us." Becket said, "I'm not leaving this," because he knows he's probably going to get killed somewhere. So he refuses to leave and he sits down and he starts praying in the church. So priests and probably monks and other church officials are probably coming at this point to see what the noise is. And the knights panic, and one of them just swings his sword and hits Becket in the back of the head while he's praying to the altar. I don't think there's anything worse you can do. If you want to go to hell, you kill the archbishop or the pope while he's praying in the most important church in the country. That's a direct, straight ticket to hell. However, I guess this knight wasn't thinking about his soul, so he's hit him in the back of the head with his sword and cut his head open, and his brains and blood fell all over the place. That's in the middle of the church, and then they ran away. So that's how Becket died. That's a horrible murder, and I guess it's the equivalent of something these days when you see a murder and everybody catches it on camera and it's in front of everybody. I'm not going to compare it to any of the recent ones, but when the whole world sort of sees what happened, and it's so violent and shocking that they can't believe it. The whole country hears this story immediately, and everybody is like, oh, well, the king told the knight to do it. The knights are going to hell, Henry's going to hell. The result of this is that he has to be punished in front of everyone. He has to take off his shirt, and a priest whips him in front of crowds of people who watch the king get beaten like a criminal, like a slave. I can't imagine if Moon Jae-in did something terrible, or Xi Jinping or Donald Trump, that if all the people were angry, they would grab him and pull down his pants and spank him as hard as they could. This is even worse. It's a whip on his back. That's what he has to go through, and then that is his punishment for the death of Becket. But nonetheless, this story goes over the entire culture, and he becomes a legend. So shortly after his death, Becket becomes a saint, and his shrine is at Canterbury, of course. And this will become important next class when we talk about the Canterbury Tales, because people from all over England go to visit Thomas Becket's his shrine, because he's a saint. It's a horrible story, but he is one of the most famous saints, and some people argue he's the first real English celebrity, because the story was told and circulated, exaggerated. There was rumors, and nobody really knows exactly how it happened still, but that's basically the story. So Thomas Becket, don't forget the story about him, because certainly that will be on the quiz. Last for today, we're not going to get to plagues and revolts. We'll save that for next week as we finish off the medieval times. But the Magna Carta is probably the last big event from this section, so we'll stop there. What happened was, don't be confused, it's Henry II, Richard the Lionheart, right? Henry II, Samuel Becket, they're gone. Richard takes over. Richard the Lionheart goes on crusade. He comes back. He dies. Then his younger brother John, King John, and there's only one King John because he was a really bad one. After Richard died, the King of France and John fought over Normandy, Aquitaine, Poitiers, all these places in France that belonged to John. But King Philip Augustus, the King of France, refused to recognize them. So he started attacking, and gradually he took over all the land in France that Henry II and Richard and William and all of John's ancestors had. So he fought a war. He gathered a lot of tax, which made everybody angry, and he traveled around the countryside raising all this money, and he fought a war and he lost. So that's probably the reason everybody hates him the most. But he was really, really a horrible person. He spent a lot of money on himself. He spent a lot of money on war, but he didn't spend enough money on his wife or his children or anybody else. And he had a wife and an ex-wife, and he made them live in the same house to save money, for example. He's a penny pincher. He's a greedy Scrooge. And he didn't respect other people's daughters or wives. So he would go around, and if he liked a girl, he would just take the girl from the family and use her or take her away, do whatever he wanted. And he was constantly asking for more money. And he would punish people without evidence. He would fine people, say, well, this land hasn't been paid for, so you have to pay me this money. Basically, he made all of the rich people in England hate his guts for his behavior towards the ladies, his bad manners, his greediness. his taxing. He didn't have very much to offer in terms of what he doesn't have very many good points to explain. He's one of the worst kings. So the result of this was a revolt, a rebellion. And there's more to the story, but we'll just keep it to that. Basically, there was a bunch of rich guys, we call them barons, the nobles in England. They had had enough of his behavior, his policy, and they gathered together, and with their wealth, their influence, and their soldiers, their armies, they forced him to sign a document that would make sure that he had to follow the laws that they did. So this is usually considered to be the beginning of modern democracy by some people, but that's not really true. And to be honest, neither is the Constitution of the United States. But this is the first evolutionary step. Is the king is chosen by God, but he also has to follow the laws of the land. He has to follow God's laws and the laws of the land too. He's not above the law. He also he can't throw people in jail for no reason. He can't tax everybody without consulting the leaders of the land. You can't just make up a certain amount of money and demand everybody pays it. So this is the beginning of what will become sort of a council. And eventually that'll evolve into a parliament. And then the leaders of the country, mostly people who have a lot of land, who are really wealthy, will come to visit the king, and the king will inform them of what is going on. It's not like they come to control the king. The king controls them, but they discuss it. It's in a process. And he can't take away property and people's lives and people's freedom without having a court, without going through the legal process. So this is a limitation of the king's absolute power. He can't just point at somebody, and although this does happen, kings still do point at somebody and have them killed. But usually what happens is he points at them, they get arrested, they go to court, then they're guilty, and then they get killed. So they're creating this legal process. They're creating the beginning of rights for human beings, no matter what level they are. Certainly he has to respect the upper class people, and this is a creation of, a control on how much money the king can extort from the kingdom. William could just take money from wherever he wanted and nobody could stop him, and there was no limit. But now the barons are going to have to be consulted in order to increase tax. And this is going to change. It's not immediately going to change, but after several hundred years, increasingly, English people are going to say the Magna Carta says that if you want to tax the people, you've got to have the approval of the leaders of the people. You can't just tax. That's not allowed. And this is going to be enforced, stronger and stronger as the course goes on. So Magna Carta is 1215. You have to remember that number. We've got two so far, 1066, 1215. Norman invasion, and today Magna Carta, because it's the beginning of the process of human rights, justice, and proper taxation, legal taxation in the Kingdom of England. And eventually that'll be extended to all of Great Britain. So there is a little bit left to the chapter. If you get your book, you will see there's also the Peasants' Revolt, the Great Famine, and the Black Death. But we don't have time to talk about that this week, and I think that's enough material from last lecture and this lecture to do our quiz on Monday. And our lecture on Monday will wrap up this chapter in the book, and I'll talk about the Black Death then. Okay? So refer to the website, please. If you have any concerns that you don't know how to do the quiz, it's going to be the exact same on Monday. If you have a concern about not knowing how to log in, how to do it, the best thing to do is to phone the English department and ask Yongnam, because the secretary, Yongnam, he's a very nice guy, and I actually don't know how to manage this that well. He helped me set it up. So if you need some technical assistance, he is the best one to ask. Actually, not me. But I can assure you the quiz is working perfectly. You need a good internet connection. You need to log in on time. and you need to complete the form and submit it by pressing the right button. If you don't do that, there's nothing I can do to help you. Okay? So Monday we'll have a quiz, and then we'll have a lecture to go along with that, and then it'll be Chuseok and we'll have a little break. I won't give you a lecture over Chuseok, just the one on Monday that follows up the quiz, and then you'll have a week off to enjoy your family and friends and take it easy. Okay? So that's it for today. Thank you for listening. I know this was a long one, but I did want to explain a few things related to the quiz before we finished. So that's it. Have a nice day.